Alright, so there's a lot of information going around on the internet and in other circles in general about Darwin's views on race and his views on racism. Some people will talk about Darwin having racist attitudes. Others will say, no, no, that's not true. And some people say, well, Darwin never wrote about human evolution. He only wrote about the evolution of, of other living things. So I did a lot of research for this video, and I wanted to clarify a lot and kind of set the record straight with regards to history. So basically, in Origin of Species, Darwin did not directly deal with human evolution, although being the book that it was, you would have to be, I think, you definitely would not be the brightest bulb in the box if you didn't understand that he was kind of getting at something, saying, hey, hey, this is probably how humans arose to, without, directly saying it. I mean, people in the 1800s weren't like people are today. They didn't have to have everything spoon-fed to them by the Kardashians. So, with that said, of course, a few years after Darwin wrote Origin of Species, he wrote a book called The Descent of Man. And in that book, he dealt primarily with human evolution. And I read a good portion of that book in preparation for this video. I did not read the whole thing because, part of it was time, because I was in college at the time, and also, I hate to admit it, but I basically lost my electronic bookmark. And it also seemed like it was kind of sufficient because Darwin spent quite a bit of the book dealing with the topic of race, and the later part of the book he was dealing with other things that are interesting from a historical perspective, from kind of a history nerd perspective, but they weren't quite relevant to the topic of this video. So what prompted this was I was sitting in my genetic engineering class, and it was the professor, stood up and he was talking to us, and he said, hey, does everybody know what today is? And it's like, I'm like, no. And it goes, well, it's Abraham Lincoln's birthday. I'm like, oh, okay. And then he says, well, guess what? It's also another person's birthday. Do you know who it is? And like, who else is it? He's like, oh, it's Charles Darwin's birthday. And I'm like, oh, okay. And he said, besides sharing the same birthday, Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin also shared something else in common. And, he said, do you guys know what it was, And we kind of looked at each other, and I didn't know either. And he goes, well, both of them were abolitionists. And of course I was aware of that, but I didn't realize that was what he was hinting at. And, he said, they were both abolitionists, talked about how great Darwin was. And I was like, wait a minute, because we need to have, some balance and perspective. Especially when we talk about history, we can't imagine the historical figures were something they weren't. Generally, historical figures aren't all angel or all devil. They're human, they're fallible, they're flawed. And so I, raised my hand and said, well, Darwin, was an abolitionist, yeah, but he was also, very much a racist. He said that, black people and, non-whites were less intelligent than the whites, and that they were evolutionarily inferior. And, my professor goes, well, that's not true. Yeah, it is. It's a fact of history. It's not a secret. And he said, no, it's not. That's not true. And because the professor was very adamant to me that, in a polite way, he wasn't rude. He just said, well, that's not true. So that's what prompted me to say, hey, let me go look up some quotes from Darwin, and just so that I can't be accused of quote mining, let me go read the context. And lo and behold, almost all of the quotes were from one particular book, The Descent of Man. So I said, okay, let me read this book. I found it on LibriVox, so you can listen to it for free. And for me, I'm more of an audio. I learn better by audio than by visual. So for me, it's easier to read a book using the audio than the visual. So that's how I read books. And Some people might laugh at that and say, well, that doesn't count, you didn't really read the book. However, the information content, whether it's audio or visual, is exactly the same. Whether you read it, visually or audibly, it makes no difference. Now, if you weren't paying attention, audibly, then that's something else. But people can decide not to pay attention visually too. Sometimes I read the same book as somebody, and they say, "Well, what'd you think of this?" And I'm thinking, "What book did you read?" And it's clear sometimes people aren't paying attention. Anyway, I am bunny trailing, so what I want to do is I have some quotes from Darwin. And when I say that Darwin did hold to some racist views, that doesn't mean that he was a jerk. Darwin viewed certain groups of people as being closer to the apes than others. He viewed white man as being the highest, and other groups being somewhere between the white man and the ape. And that doesn't mean necessarily that he was a jerk. It doesn't mean that he was this big a-hole, as we typically associate a racist with being. All it means is that he had some wrong ideas about biology. He had some wrong ideas about human cognitive ability. And a lot of people, it is true that a lot of people in his time did as well. However, you can definitely see that Darwin was a gentleman, but you can also see that his views on evolution influenced his expectations about human beings. Because, hey, if you have it where you have a branching evolutionary tree, and apes are one branch of the tree, humans are another part, and then you have lots of branches coming off the human branch, including, in Darwin's view, the European humans, and Australian Aborigines and Africans. In his view, these different races are different branches on that part of the evolutionary tree. And so he had no reason to expect all humans to be equal in intelligence and equal in other areas as well. And while it is true that we do have some minor biological differences, obviously people from Africa are generally darker than people from Europe, but the biological differences actually tend to end there. And interestingly enough, actually I'm going to hold that thought to the end. So what I want to do here is I have a bunch of quotes from Darwin. I have quotes of what he actually said about race, and I'm going to read them on camera. And people can accuse me of quote mining all day long. However, we live in the world of Google. We live in the world where you can read Darwin's books for yourself online. And I'll put the quotes in the comments section. That way, people can look them up at their leisure. So, first quote. There is, however, no doubt that the various races, when carefully compared and measured, differ much from each other, as in the texture of the hair, the relative proportions of all parts of the body, the capacity of the lungs, the form and capacity of the skull, and even in the convolutions of the brain. But it would be an endless task to specify the number of points of structural difference. The races differ also in constitution, in acclimatization. Sorry, this is an older book, so very high vocabulary in the 1800s. In acclimatization and in liability to certain diseases. Their mental characteristics are likewise very distinct. Obviously, this is an important part here. And I'm going to reread that part. Their mental characteristics are likewise very distinct, chiefly as it would appear in their emotional, but partially in their intellectual facilities. But partly in their intellectual faculties. Sorry. Everyone who has had the opportunity of comparison must have been struck with the contrast between the taciturn, even morose aborigines of South America, and the light-hearted, talkative Negroes. There is a nearly similar contrast between the Malays and the Papuans, who live under the same physical conditions and are separated from each other only by a narrow space of sea. That's the end of the first quote. Next one. The great break in the organic chain between man and his nearest allies, which cannot be bridged over by any extinct or living species, has often been advanced as a grave objection to the belief that man is descended from some lower form. But this objection will not appear of much weight to those who, from general reasons, believe in the general principle of evolution. Breaks often occur in all parts of the series, some being wide, sharp, and defined, others less so in various degrees. As between the orang and its nearest allies, between the tarsius and other lemuridae, between the elephant and, a more striking manner, between the ornithorhynchus or echidna, and all other mammals. But these breaks depend merely on the number of related forms which have become extinct. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schoffelson has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So that's the end of that first quote, or that second quote. So it's very obvious, from that quote, that Darwin viewed Caucasian humans as being higher in evolutionary development than other races of man. And so here's the next quote. The belief that there exists in man some close relation between the size of the brain and the development of the intellectual faculties is supported by the comparison of the skulls of savage and civilized races, of ancient and modern people, and by the analogy of the whole vertebrate series. Dr. J. Barnard Davis has proved, by many careful measurements, that the mean internal capacity of the skull in Europeans is 92.3 cubic inches, in Americans 87.5, in Asiatics 87.1, and in Australians only 81.9 cubic inches. Professor Broca found that in the 19th century skulls from graves in Paris were larger than those from vaults of the 12th century, and in the proportion of 1484 to 1426, and that the increased size, as ascertained by measurements, was exclusively in the frontal part of the skull, the seat of the intellectual faculties. Pritchard is persuaded that the present inhabitants of Britain have much more capacious brain cases than the ancient inhabitants. Nevertheless, it must be admitted that some skulls of very high antiquity, such as the famous one of Neanderthal, are well developed and capacious. With respect to the lower animals, M.E. Larrett, by comparing the cranial of tertiary and recent mammals belonging to the same groups, has come to the remarkable conclusion that the brain is generally larger than the convolutions are more complex in the more recent forms. On the other hand, I have shown that the brains of domestic rabbits are considerably reduced in bulk in comparison with those of the wild rabbit or hare, and this may be attributed to their having been closely confined during many generations, so that they have exerted their intellect, instincts, senses, and voluntary movements but little. And I wrote myself a little note here. It says, note that Darwin makes it very clear that it is his view that different races differ in their intelligence due, at least in part, to the differences in their brain size. And obviously there's a lot of fallacies that Darwin seems to make here. You have to consider nature versus nurture. In the 21st century, we would look at biology and say, okay, what is written in the DNA, and what is the result of just being raised in different environments. Twin studies being the classic example of that sort of thing. In Darwin's time, it wasn't quite so black and white as it is today. And granted, everybody knows that the way a person or an animal turns out is partly nature, partly nurture, and a combination of the two. But in Darwin's time, I feel like, from what I have read, it does seem that there wasn't quite quite as distinct of a line as there is today, because they thought the environment played quite a different role on the permanent. Gosh, it's so hard to describe this without using anachronistic terminology. In Darwin's time, people thought that, hey, the heritable traits are changed based quite a bit on use and disuse. And we learn about Lamarckian evolution in school, but students are generally not taught in middle school and high school that Darwin actually believed the same thing. The idea of Mendelian genetics was actually resisted quite a bit because of its contrast to what Darwin was teaching, or at least its perceived contrast. But anyway, so I have another quote here. It is not from Charles Darwin. It is from a close associate of his named Thomas Huxley. And the reason I want to bring up this quote is because I think that it's a very clear quote. It's not directly from Darwin himself, of course, and it's Huxley expressing his opinions, but it does show the views that early evolutionists had. And so Huxley said in Emancipation, Black and White in 1865, "It may be quite true that some Negroes are better than some white men, but no rational man, cognizant of the facts, believes that the average Negro is equal, still less the superior, of the average white man. And if this be true, it is simply incredible that when all of his disabilities are removed, and our prognathous relative has a fair field and no favor, as well as no oppressor, he will be able to compete successfully with his bigger-brained and smaller-jawed rival, in a contest which is to be carried on by thought and not by bites. The highest place in the hierarchy of civilization will assuredly not be within the reach of our dusky cousins, though it is by no means necessary that they should be restricted to the lowest." So what Huxley's saying here was very typical of the rest of what I read, from Darwin. It just made it a lot more clear. Darwin was very eloquent and very Victorian in his writing, and I thought that Huxley was a little more to the point about it, but they were both saying pretty much the same things. It's not necessarily the fact that every white man is necessarily smarter than every black man. That's not what they were saying. They were saying that the average white man was smarter than the average black man. And obviously what they're saying is not true. However, it is what they believed at the time, and it influenced a lot of people throughout the 20th century. You think of the eugenics movement, you think of the Nazi movement, the Nazis trying to breed the perfect race, same with American eugenicists, and, the start of Planned Parenthood. Now, some people might not like that I'm saying that. They might not like that I, said, hey, Planned Parenthood was eugenic, but it's history. Not liking something doesn't make it not true. And, just because something's politically incorrect or, offensive, it doesn't mean it's not true. It just makes it history. Now, does that necessarily mean that Planned Parenthood's bad? Does that necessarily make evolution wrong? No, of course not. And I don't know of it. I don't think any educated person would ever say, well, because Darwin was a racist, he was wrong. No, that's not what's being said here. All that's being said here is, his ideas did naturally lead to a racist ideology. And if we imagine a Darwinian world, just for the moment, it would not necessarily be unexpected to have different branches of human evolution that were different from each other, where some were smarter than others. It is a perfectly rational outcome given a Darwinian worldview. It doesn't mean, and if somebody held to that view, as Darwin clearly did, that doesn't necessarily make him a bad person. All it means is that biology in the 21st century has caught up. It's not true that, We may find it offensive to say that white people are smarter than black people, of course. But just because we find it offensive, that's not why that it isn't true. It's not true because it doesn't bear out with the data. It's not true because it's not reflective of reality. We can say all day, well, I'm offended by somebody saying the dolphins can't fly. Granted they can jump out of the water, but just being offended by something and something being politically incorrect or not liking something doesn't mean that it's not true. Also, liking something doesn't make it true. Truth is not determined by what we do and do not want to be wrong. But in a Darwinian worldview, it is perfectly rational to expect that different branches of a particular group of the evolution of a particular group of organism are going to differ in their intelligence in quite a few different ways. And so it's not unreasonable to expect that different branches of human evolution would have differences in intelligence. Just like if you zoom out, the different apes, have more, well, not more or less, but orangutans aren't as smart as humans. Chimpanzees aren't as smart as humans. Gorillas aren't as smart as humans. Now, if you look at chimps, orangutans, and gorillas, I'm sure that one of those species would be smarter than the other two, and that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to expect. If you were looking at things from a Darwinian perspective. Now, so I actually summarized that right here. What I wrote was, Darwin's writings on race seem very much in line with those of Huxley. While they readily acknowledge that some Africans are more intelligent than some Europeans, etc., they made it very clear that the idea that the two groups were of equal intelligence on average was not, in their view, supported by the facts. So in their view, the facts said whites were the smartest, other groups not so much. Now, what is my opinion about all of this? My opinion is that Darwin was a gentleman. My opinion is that he was wrong. And I find it very interesting that in the 21st century we are finding that all human beings belong to one race. It says in the Bible that all human beings are one blood. We all belong to one biological race. And granted, you might not believe the Bible. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't matter what we believe. That doesn't reflect in reality. And I want to add to that. Somebody had a quote one time. It doesn't matter what you believe, it matters what's true. And in the Bible, it says that we are all one race. Modern genetics has now caught up to that and shown that all human beings belong to one race. In fact, it's to the point where every human being in the world is considered to be Homo sapiens sapiens. We're all considered to be part of not only the same species, but the same subspecies. And, so it's interesting that what we have with modern genetics confirms the predictions of creation, it confirms the predictions of the Bible. However, what Darwin said about humanity turned out to be wrong. And somebody might not like that I say that, but again, it's a fact of history that Darwin had the views that he did. It's a fact of history that the Bible says what it says. And it is a fact, from modern genetics that all human beings are essentially one race. And I think that is definitely something to think about. It's definitely something to consider. By itself, it does not make the Bible right and make Darwin wrong, but it is something to consider. And for those of you who don't know, my bachelor's degree is in biotechnology and molecular bioscience. I have 2 science degrees. So I'm not some guy who just gets on YouTube talking about science and talking about things like this without knowing what he's talking about. But anyway, thank you for watching my video. I know it was long. However, I thought it warranted the length. So thank you very much. This is Greg, out.